Well, thank you for being here. I'm Jim Hodges. My wife Rachel and I sponsor these events. We think it's incredibly important that the community and business students have a chance to hear from business leaders and world leaders about important events. You know, it's one thing to learn accounting and finance and economics and marketing. It's another to apply those and find out how nonprofits and business leaders apply those things. We're particularly pleased tonight to be able to present a program which I think is incredibly important, not only with issues that impact Ukraine, but to world hunger, poverty across the globe. And my friend of 40 plus years, David Beasley, will be our speaker tonight. Now, I was going to make fun of his beard, but I was a little worried after Chris Rock did this with Will Smith that we might have an incident here that might impact his reputation as a man of peace. Let's just put it that way. But it is great to see him. It's great to see Mary Wood today. And certainly, I think this is a phenomenal program for our community and state. We announced earlier today, Governor Beasley, an initiative to try to raise some money. My friend Gresham Barrett, former congressman, is here and talked about how we might raise some money to impact the World Food Program and particularly to deal with the issue of relief in Ukraine. It is my pleasure now to turn the program over to Alex Harrell, who is the outgoing student body president at the University of South Carolina. Alex is a fixture around the State House and someone who's very interested in state and global issues. Alex?
Thank you for the introduction, Governor Hodges, and good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Harrell, and I am really pleased to be here speaking with you all tonight, so thank you for having me. A question I've received a lot over the past year is, Alex, why would you decide to run for student body president? And the simple answer to that is serving students and helping my friends. It's as simple as that. Oftentimes, I would receive an email from a student who has a problem or needs help, whatever it may be, and I can assure you there is no greater feeling than being able to help them or fix their problem. I believe this is one of the most unique parts of my role, public office or government in general, constituent services. As a political science major, government and public office have always fascinated me because it allows you to do just that, help the people in your community. In my time as a political science student, I've had the great opportunity to work in many different levels of government, on the state level as a page and as an intern in the governor's office, and on the federal level as an intern on Capitol Hill. Through these roles, I've been able to see just how public office and government can help the people of your community. Another question I've been getting a lot recently as I prepare to graduate this May is, Alex, what do you want to do when you grow up? Well, the jury is still out on that one. While I do fully not know, I hope to continue being a servant of my community, just as Governor Beasley and Governor Hodges have done. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Laney, our former student body treasurer.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laney Quickle, and I have been excited to be the student body treasurer for the past year. It is such an honor to be speaking with you all tonight, as I myself am an international business student, and this event has everything to do with what I'm studying. Coming into the international business program, I learned so much about the full scope of the offerings in the #1 international business program in the United States. This program is not simply about business, it's about how the world works, about how we interact with one another, about analysis of social responsibility, and about what we can be doing for international success tomorrow. We analyze current issues and their implications in the realm of business. Our special guest speaker today, David Beasley, leads the United Nations World Food Program, the world's largest humanitarian organization based in Rome. The World Food Program uses food assistance to build a pathway to peace, stability, and prosperity for people recovering from conflict, disasters, and the impact of climate change. It is the epitome of international business. This organization has worked across the world to provide people with the food resources they need to pave their own personal paths in a diverse range of occupations, both through social and economic development. Furthermore, this program analyzes and responds to what happens in the world today. So I know that I personally am very excited to hear today's remarks. With that being said, it is my great pleasure to introduce our featured speakers and panelists today. The Folk Center Forum welcomes former South Carolina Governor David Beasley, Executive Director of the World Food Program, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020. We are proud to have such a distinguished alumnus of the University of South Carolina here today. Governor Beasley continues his life's work bridging political, religious, and ethnic boundaries to champion economic development and education. Two Folk Center board member companies are also here as panelists today. Val Dolcini, Head of Business Sustainability and Government Affairs, North America at Syngenta. Syngenta is a global agtech company operating in 90 countries, helping millions of farmers around the world to grow safe and nutritious food. Johan Barr is a member of the executive board of the Hilti Foundation and the director for affordable housing and technology. The Hilti Foundation's programs empower people to improve their skills, education, and economic opportunities, primarily focused on developing countries and emerging economies. The foundation contributes to building strong societies through creating partner networks around the world. Finally, thank you to the forum moderator, International Business Associate Professor Andrew Spicer. Dr. Spicer received his PhD from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. His research and teaching focus on the intersection of business and society in a global economy and the long-term evolution of corporate sustainability programs and strategies. Please welcome to the podium, Governor David Beasley.
Laney, thank you. Alex, it's great to be here. All the places I go with war and conflict, it's great to be anywhere where bullets aren't flying and bombs aren't blowing up and people aren't starving to death. And it's hard to believe, and I think the young people need to really hear this as much as anyone. If you could cut it down a little bit. You can't believe that 200 years ago, 95% of the people on earth were in extreme poverty. When I hear people today complaining, I'm like, number one, you ought to go with me. Or number two, you need to see from whence we've come. And the reason this is important because we've made such extraordinary progress in the last 200 years because of schools like the University of South Carolina, the Darla School of Business, building institutions, better organizations, better programs to share more wealth than any time period in world history. Now, that sounds great. Look where we are. Look where we've come from. But try explaining that to the 10% that we're not reaching. Because now we've got 10% of the people on earth are in grave poverty. So do we tear down the system that's now giving hope and shelter and food and wealth to 90% of the population to reach the 10? And that's what some people want to do. Or do we continue to focus, build on the successes we've had to reach that final 10%? And you'd have different ideas. You'd have like Democrat Governor Hodges and Republican David Beasley fighting it out on the political spectrum. But by and large, our ideas are very similar. And at the end of the day, there was never anything personal. Now today, you look at the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans don't even talk to one another, and it's absolutely horrendous what's happening. And I never doubted for a second that every idea that Governor Hodges had was, in his mind and heart, better for South Carolina, and the same thing with me. And we'd have a difference of opinion, but at the end of the day, we were South Carolinians, American, wanting to build a better, stronger state. But today, in American politics, I get so fed up with both parties, quite frankly. And we've made such great success. When I took this role, kicking and screaming, literally 5 years ago, there were 80 million people marching towards starvation. Not chronic hunger, that's a different discussion. 80 million. My goal was to put the World Food Program out of business. Because I know, just like Governor Hodges, we know that the answer to ending poverty is the private sector, and what can we in government do to incentivize the private sector, and how can we build a better system to improve on what we know to be. So when I took this role, 80 million people marching to starvation. We're facing 4 countries with famine at the time. You had President Trump, who had just gotten elected, was declaring the zero out international foreign aid. I didn't want a UN job. And my Democrat and Republican friends in the Senate and the House saying you're the only one that could talk him out of this. And I'm like, well, let me talk him out of it. I still don't want a UN job. And it really wasn't that hard to get friends at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, Republicans and Democrats, to come together on strategic, effective international aid. And so what happened was quite remarkable in the last few years. Some really good and much really bad. When I joined at 80 million people marching in starvation, the number spiked to 135 right before COVID. And the question would be, well, what was the driving force? It was man-made conflict, war, conflict. 80% of our operations are in war zones. That's another discussion we'll get into a little bit tonight. The second major factor of driving hunger was climate shocks, climate change, climate extremes. COVID comes along and the number jumps from 135 million to 276 million people marching to starvation. And out of that 276, 45 million are at famine's door as we speak in 38 countries. Do you want to know which countries will destabilize in the next 12 months? Well, I can tell you which ones they are. And over a year ago, I began predicting that 2022 would be the worst humanitarian year in the history of modern world. And people are like, how do you see that? Well, you know, when we feed 125 million people any given day, week, or month. If I fed everybody in your neighborhood every day for 2 years, I know what's going to be happening in your neighborhood. And we see trends and we see it happening. But COVID comes along with an economic ripple effect and just devastates the poorest of the poor countries. So in my Nobel Peace Prize speech back in December, I laid it out very clearly that 2022 was going to be a catastrophe. We weren't expecting Ethiopia, we weren't expecting Afghanistan, and we sure as hell were not expecting Ukraine. As we were laying out the problems that we were going to be facing. Food prices were already spiking before Ukraine. Fuel prices were already spiking before Ukraine. Shipping costs were already spiking. We were beginning to cut rations for the poorest of the poor in countries all over the world to 50%. Can you imagine telling your child, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to give you only 50% of what you need? We feed 13 million on any given day, week, and month in Yemen. I cut 8 million down to 50% rations a month ago. Next week, we'll probably cut them down to 0. Niger, 50%. Chad, 50%. Ethiopia, 50%. Let me just keep going around the world. Pre-Ukraine. All we need is money. That's simple. Now, we'll get into the long-term discussion of these solutions, but as long as you have man-made conflict, you're going to have starvation, destabilization, and mass migration. It's that simple. And quite frankly, the world leaders are not focused like they need to be focused in the last few years. It's heartbreaking to see what's happening. Now, so Ukraine comes along. Ukraine grows enough food for 400 million people. See, my concern in the fall of this year was pricing. Your impact or impact on you would be you'd go probably buy less Netflix movies. You go afford the food you need, but you're not going to starve. You might have to have an inconvenience somewhere. But in the countries that I'm in, they live hand to mouth every day. They don't have a pantry full of food. And when food prices go up, children starve, countries destabilize, conflict develops, mass migration occurs. And it's 1,000 times more expensive after the fact versus us getting in root cause. So Ukraine comes along, a country between it and Russia that grows 30% of all wheat, 20% of all corn, maize, 76 to 80% of all sunflower cooking oil, 40% of all the base product for fertilizers comes out of Belarus and Russia. All this is frozen right now. And guess where all the farmers are in Ukraine? They're on the battlefront. We're feeding 1 million people right now inside Ukraine. They'll be scaling up to about 6 million people over the next couple of months. The farmers can't plant the corn they need to plant in April. They're not going to be able to harvest the wheat they planted right before the war started in July because they're on the battlefronts. You ought to try finding truck drivers right now inside Ukraine. The people that have already fled outside are the lucky ones because they're being met with loving arms from strangers and friends and family, many of which they don't know, but they're getting food, shelter, and their families and children out of harm's way. But the ones that are left, 40 million. It's a very difficult dilemma. And so we've got Mariupol, which is besieged. How do we get food inside Mariupol? Kiev, we're moving food supplies inside the major cities, and Ukraine is about 8 times bigger than South Carolina. So you can imagine you just don't put up one little warehouse somewhere. And what about all the grain that has already been harvested before the war? We don't want to lose that. And anyway, we don't have time to get into all the logistics and supply chain. We are the logistics and supply chain hub for the entire United Nations and the NGO world. When COVID hit, it was us. But people are running for the hills. We're running out to beat the people. From COVID supplies, UNICEF supplies, UNHCR refugee supplies, of course, food as well. We are the supply chain. Trucks, ships, airplanes, we drop it from the air and you name it. Over 20-something thousand employees directly that work with the World Food Program, world's largest humanitarian operation. And so now, countries like Egypt, 85% dependent upon Ukraine wheat. Lebanon, 80% in 2020, 60%, 65 on average. I could keep going around the world for the number of countries that rely on Ukraine and Russian grain. The question is going to be whether the world leaders that I spoke to, the G7 leaders last week about, can you offset by a lot of things that you'll be seeing in the news in the next week, 2 weeks, that we're talking about how to offset this loss of all this grain. It may not happen, the loss of the grain, but do you want to take that chance? What do you think is going to happen when you don't have enough food inside New York City, London, Berlin? Price hikes, one thing. Availability, well, you'll see your neighborly love in a different way. But the World Food Program, in my opinion, we embellish or we imbue that love your neighbor. Because that's what we want to do, is come in and help the neighbor, bring stability and help. Now, what I like to talk about, and this is my area of love, is economic empower, economic development. How do we put the World Food Program out of business? That was my goal when I arrived. So we get the Nobel Peace Prize when everything's going to hell in a handbasket, and I'm like, I should be fired, actually. It's getting worse, you know, versus what we were hoping to do. And the long-term solution to poverty and hunger is the private sector. And the United Nations for quite some time shunned the private sector. And I'm not talking about the private sector in terms of financial contributions into us. Yeah, right now, because of this perfect storm, we're billions of dollars short of what we need. Yes, we need, under this perfect storm, some extraordinary stepping up by the private sector. In the height of COVID, the billionaires' average net worth increase per day was 5.2 billion. But what I'm seeing, particularly among the young CEOs today, there's a sense of social responsibility different than we've ever seen, in my opinion, as a corporate community. That it's not just about giving money. That's nice, that's good. Okay, give us some, we need it right now, but I need your engagement. And so we look to the private sector to help us be more strategic, more efficient, more effective. We're saving hundreds of millions of dollars a year right now by more efficient systems, not to get into the details of that here. But where I really need the private sector to engage is in developing nations, not at war, because you don't want to go invest $500 million in a nation at war, but a poverty-stricken nation. As I'm telling shareholders, Wall Street, you've got to come into the poor countries and think a little bit differently, be a little bit less efficient, have a longer return on your investment, be willing to make a little bit less over a longer period, because if you'll do that, the stability of these nations will take place and economic empowerment will come to fruition, but you've got to take a longer game at it versus the short term. Trust me, I see it every single day. What happens when we try to do it a way that doesn't bring fruition. Now, one of the things that we do, we believe that every able-bodied adult ought to be in a community improvement project. And if you want to change an African nation, put it into the hands of the African women. Holy moly. They're the most entrepreneurial people I have ever met in my life. So historically, we would come into a country and let's say there was a village right here that cost us $50,000 a year to feed, might be 300 people. So I'd come in with my team and said, no. We're going to be doing $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year, $1 million a year for 50 more years. Let's go down and let's work and do water harvesting, put down a water well, do irrigation systems. And it costs less, like in this one village, it was less than $50,000. But guess what? Year 3, 4, 5. And I sat down with Biba. This was 3 weeks ago in Chad. She said, Mr. Beasley, with your programs, we're no longer needing your outside help. We're feeding our entire village, and now we're buying medicines for our children and clothes for our families. In fact, I just paid for my son's wedding. And she says, and I no longer live in a straw hut. I live in a clay hut now. That's a big deal in Chad. But it was this entrepreneurial spirit that she had. And when we come in with that entrepreneurial spirit and start developing supply chains, remarkable things begin to happen. People don't want to rely on outside support. They want to be free and independent and take care of their families and their children. And the private sector is critical. And tonight we'll have some discussions in this. And you can run this rabbit in 40,000 different ways and spend all days and days upon discussing options and opportunities. But believe you me, the models that we have designed and built is making the world a better place. But quite frankly, we're going in the wrong direction right now. And it's not because of the supply chain systems. Yes, they can always be improved. It's because of the human heart, greed, corruption is our biggest problem on earth today. If we're struggling to feed 7.8 billion people, not because of lack of food, but for access and money issues, when there's $430 trillion worth of wealth, imagine what's going to happen when we have 10 billion people. And the climate extremes are going to be driving more mass migration and displacement beyond anything we've seen. As I have some of my conservative friends who say, well, climate change. I said, look, I'm not the expert of what's causing the climate to change, but I can tell you this, come with me and let me show you in these countries what's happening. More flash flooding, more droughts. You actually could end up with the same average rain waterfall for the year, but it's more drought this time of the season and more flash flooding than this time of the season. And you ought to see, we've rehabilitated with our beneficiaries 3.5 million acres of land. While the West is arguably creating these climate issues, it's the poorest of the poor that's greening the planet back up. Our beneficiaries have planted over 7 billion trees in the past years. We built our beneficiaries 81,000 kilometers of feeder roads so they can move products to the market. 59, I think it's 1,000 kilometers of irrigation lines. World Food Program is quite different than most people realize. But we depend on supply chain systems, economics, and to me, how can we incentivize and empower the private sector to be more strategically engaged? You cannot take food security for granted. You'll see so this fall because the world really is in serious trouble. The economic indices and indicators for the Arab Spring are prevalent today as it was then, except it's worse than during the Arab Spring. And while the Europeans are now focused on the refugees coming from Ukraine, if you ignore the Sahel, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, there's 500 million people in a destabilized environment. From Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Niger, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. Except the difference there is they're infiltrated by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, if you have mass migration into Europe. And then you look at Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, very destabilized. Imagine Europe being overrun by dozens and dozens of millions of people. As I had said earlier, we feed a Syrian refugee in Syria for 50 cents. That same Syrian ends up in Berlin, $70. United States border. I was in Guatemala a few months ago, and Washington Post came out with an article that we were spending in the United States taxpayers $3,750 per child per week at our border on Mexico. For $1 per child per week, I can bring stability into villages. Now, what do you think is a better value, and where do you think that child wants to be? I have not met hardly any refugees that wanted to leave home. They don't want to leave home. But if you can't feed your child and have no degree of peace or security, you go do what you need to do for your family. And if we can end food security as a weapon and bring stability, we will end migration by necessity, and then you're left with migration by choice, and that's a pleasant debate. But when people are fearing for their lives and doing what they need to do, the cost is astronomical. Berlin did a study that showed for the refugees that they had that came to Berlin, it cost them over 5 years, $125 billion for 1 million refugees in 5 years. 50 cents a day, do the math, for 1 million over 5 years. Imagine. And if it ends up in war and conflict, thousands of times more. But the systems that we have in this country give us the wealth that we have to create hope and opportunity, stability. But we cannot stand still and say it's finished. We still have people that are poor. We still must reach those people. We have so much to offer. As I said to Bezos and to Elon Musk and Bill Gates, we were having dinner a few weeks ago in Abu Dhabi. We were talking about, look, I want the wealthiest of the wealthy, these very successful, brilliant minds, to help us end world hunger. I mean, look what you've done with the mind you have. Let's come together to make certain that we end poverty and hunger around the world while we build rockets that go to Mars and cell phones that can do amazing things. Anyway, let me stop right there because I could go on, and Andy's looking at me like it's time to quit. I get excited about this because this is extremely, extremely important. People around the earth, I tell you, I never appreciated poverty and suffering until I began seeing children all over the world suffering as I have seen. And when you see humanity as a complete whole, and then you ask us, when I don't have enough money, we have to choose which children eat, which children don't eat, which children live, which children die. How would you like that job? And that's what we face. And there's no reason for it. So what you're doing here, I cannot tell you how very important it is. If you don't think it's important, come with me to some of the countries that I go, and you'll see what happens when you don't have institutions putting systems in place and always struggling to find a better way, no matter how good you're doing it. Never rest on your laurels. Never be afraid of moving the cheese or whatever it might be, that type of thing. So I guess I'll stop right here and turn it over to you, Andy. But thank you for letting me be with you.
So thank you very much. I don't know whether to cry or to clap after that speech. The format is going to be very simple. We're going to go to our two guests to respond from their corporations and their foundations perspective, and then we're going to open up for questions. I'll ask some questions, and eventually, if you want to ask questions, we'll go to the microphone. We're going to start with Val Decini from Syngenta.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you for the invitation, Andy, and Governor Beasley. A belated congratulations on behalf of my colleagues at Syngenta on receiving the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize. I think we should give him a round of applause for that. It's a significant accomplishment.
That was a phone call you don't get often.
He said that was a phone call you don't always get. I'm sure. But, it's hard to disagree with anything that you said, Governor, about the state of the world. I think, the world is going to hell in the proverbial handbasket, and there seems to be little that we can do about it. But there are some things that I think we can look at as potential silver linings, and you talked about the World Food Programme's work in Africa and Syngenta and some of our competitors, frankly, and the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa and other organizations have teamed up to form something called the Farm to Market Alliance, which speaks to the very issues that Governor Beasley was talking about in terms of providing folks in Africa with the ability to learn how to fish, as opposed to continually receiving bags of wheat or maize or other things saying from the people of the United States. That's wonderful. But really what we need to do is build in resiliency and sustainability into local economies there to ensure that sub-Saharan Africa in particular has the tools that it needs to empower those entrepreneurial African women in villages all across the continent of Africa. And I think that that's where companies like Syngenta and others can really partner for impact. It's one thing as a big corporation, and as I think someone said, we're operating in 90 countries and 50,000 employees and 25 billion in annual revenues. We're looking to partner for impact. We want to really make an impact when we decide to partner on something, and the Farm to Market Alliance is a wonderful example of that.
It really is. Tanzania, remarkable. And that's a growing partnership, but
It's great. Johan?
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here. Thank you, Governor Beasley, for your speech. It's great to hear your words. I couldn't agree more with what you said. And at the Hilti Foundation and at Hilti globally, we learn a lot from your words and what you do at the World Food Programme, which is great work. What I enjoyed what you said, especially was about what business can do to drive impact. And it's in fact much more than just providing financial means. You mentioned efficiency. And when I look at our work at the Hilti Foundation, that's exactly what we try to achieve. We not only get to use our financial means to create social impact as a foundation, but we rely on the corporate expertise, on the knowledge and expertise of our corporate colleagues in driving programs for sustainable impact and sustainable change. So when I look, for example, into market-based mechanisms that we apply in the housing sector to help families in need finding a decent place to call home, I look into our work at the Hilti Corporation and find colleagues who are experts in logistics, who are experts in engineering, and ask them to help me define my programs and deliver aid that is cost-effective, that uses our knowledge for last mile distribution of housing products, that uses sustainable mechanisms to create change. And I think, and that's what I guess you learn as well in your work, through these mechanisms, we can create much more than just by traditional charity. And I mean, responsible leadership has always existed, and Hilti is a family-owned business, and it's deeply rooted in our DNA, what I call responsible leadership. But we also learn there is no one who can do this alone. It's partnerships, and you mentioned that, in which we have to invest, in which we have to create, because in the end, everyone just can bring what they are best at. In our case, it might be engineering, it might be logistics, and others bring other things to the table. And only if we join forces and do this together, we can really create sustainable change. And I feel that's what we need to talk about.
All right, well, thank you. Let me ask the first question. We seem, when we talk about these topics, to oscillate between hope and fear. We bring businesses in and we talk about hope, because that's what we want to teach our students, and we're going to talk to the next generation here. I felt a lot of fear when you were speaking, like more fear than I felt for a long time. How big is the crisis going to be, and how do we even grasp it and keep hope when we see these things around us?
It's much worse than you think.
Oh God.
When I sit down with, let's say, European leaders in private, and I begin laying out, it's one thing to look at one little category and draw conclusions. Another thing to start seeing it all. And we averted famine and serious issues in the last 3 years. I went to the world leaders and they stepped up and made extraordinary commitments. But if you go back right before COVID, we had a couple very strong economic years. There were a lot of reserves. There was less debt in Africa than before. And so now the amount of debt in Africa, for example, and nations around the world because of COVID and all the economic stimulus packages that were put into place to jumpstart the economies, thinking that COVID would be behind us by 2022, and it recycled and recycled. And when I start breaking down the numbers, country by country, and each country has its own unique set of numbers. And then when you break down the numbers of 45 million in famine-like conditions, you begin to, you start like getting sick on the stomach, you know. We made it through the last few years. We got ahead of it, but it's so big this time, and Ukraine on top of it. This is why, and I've been hard on the international media. I said, this crisis has been coming pre-Ukraine. And I said, if I turned on the news, it was just 95% Trump, Brexit, COVID. And the people in the world don't have any idea how bad it's happening out there. Now, fortunately, we've been able to break through the media. Ukraine, as bad as it is, helped us break through. You've got a global crisis coming. And when the leaders began listening a little more in depth, and the CNNs and the BBCs and et cetera started listening to the stories that we were beginning to paint, people began to like, whoa, we didn't realize this. And now the world is becoming more aware. You'll see the articles, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, German newspapers, London newspapers. And so the world's starting to recognize and awaken to this perfect storm that we have before us. It's still avoidable, just like we averted mass famine in the last 3 years, because we zeroed in, but we had the financial support. This is why I've come to the world billionaires in the past 6 months saying we have a perfect storm. The governments, the traditional state donors are tapped out. We've got to step up an extra 5, 6, 10 billion here. And out of $430 trillion worth of wealth, you know, you're talking about a couple of days worth of net worth increases. To me, it's not that big of a, you know, an ask, quite frankly. I think we can get through it, but it's very fragile, especially when you start looking at all the indicators. And if my economist sits down with you, you really would need to do it before dinner and not have a nice dinner. It's going to hurt your feelings.
We're going to dinner after this. Let me ask you just to follow up on that. We have a lot of international business students here, and you said if you see the global picture, what's the global picture? You brought it all the way back to New York City and London. This was a war in Ukraine. Why we've seen this huge reverberation across the world?
What was the question?
Sort of what's the global features that leads to a war in Ukraine and Russia contributing to global hunger crisis?
No, I think, as I was giving some of the numbers earlier, when 30% of all your grain comes from Ukraine and Russia, and the ports are all shut down and you can't move products right now, and 20% of all the corn around the world, and you start analyzing all these dynamics, and the 400 million people that are normally fed by Ukraine grain and food alone, that's the bread basket of the world. And that's got bread lines, from bread baskets to bread lines. And the reverberation is going to be quite extraordinary. You're already seeing pricing. The impact on fuel costs, food costs, shipping costs, just on the World Food Program per month, our increase in operational expense per month, take a wild guess of what that is.
going to ask you instead.
is $71 million at a minimum per month. So that's $850 million on my bottom line, which means I'm going to feed 4 million less people. So am I going to take food from the children in Ethiopia to give to the children in Ukraine? Or from Afghanistan to Chad? And so Afghanistan is already destabilized, very fragile. Syria is very destabilized. Lebanon is ready to collapse. Jordan, Yemen is a whole different ballgame. And then let's go into the Sahel and talk about each one of those countries. And look where Ethiopia is right now. Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, and the droughts and the flooding is only getting worse. And if we have a massive volcano right now, it would be, I just can't imagine. It's like we're the fire station. All my trucks are out right now. If I have 2 more fires right now, I don't know what we're going to do. Which means I don't know what the world's going to do, because if we're not there, I can give you the numbers in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador right now. The number of people talking about migrating from there right now has quadrupled in the last 6 months. I can keep going to the ring of fire around the world, from North Africa, Middle East, Afghanistan, and you begin to see it's not a pretty picture. But we can get through this if the world leaders will step up. We're going to all have to give a little bit. If we don't, you go pay for it 100 or 1,000 times more, because we've done those studies. When a nation destabilizes, what it costs versus coming in. And when food prices start jumping certain percentage points, you have riots, protests, destabilization, and then you get the ISIS and the Al-Qaedas and the Boko Haram that exploit those dynamics in countries really around Europe. You want to get in a frightening conversation? Let me get into that conversation. When you feed 125 million people, I can tell you where ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram are, when they move, how they move, where they move, what they do. And the World Food Program plays the most extraordinary role. This is why General Mattis, McMaster, many of them signed a letter 65 years ago saying, if you want to buy more bullets, cut the World Food Program. I would have never understood that until I took this role, seeing the significant role that it plays. And yet my goal is to put the World Food Program out of business. We got to end the wars, but it's this audience right here that can put us out of business. And I really believe that with all my heart. I really do. I think the young people have got the heart, the inspiration. They see things less divisive, less tribal than we've seen in the past several hundred years. And that gives me a lot of hope. But at the same time, they got to understand where we've come from, where we are. There's more work to do. Let's don't tear down the systems that have given this sharing of wealth. But we must continue improvement, because there are people that are still struggling. And try telling them about the American dream. And we still got work to do. And this is where R's and D's can come together. Don't get me started on R's and D's. I'm so mad with both parties, I can't see.
Well, let's switch to business for just a second, and let's switch from fear to hope. In your experiences, what seems to work, and how do we find private sector solutions, and how do we work with public sector agencies such as the World Food Program?
Look, I worked for a corporate foundation. So basically, I always feel we are sort of on the edge between the nonprofit sector and the corporate sector. And when I speak to my corporate colleagues, I feel basically we want to achieve the same thing when we look at the social dimension of business. We want to drive sustainable systems that create inclusive markets for families to develop. And when we speak about how we do this, we sometimes face a challenge, because when I speak with my partners in the nonprofit world and with my corporate colleagues, they use different language to describe the same thing. And sometimes it's hard to bring both of them together to actually define what are the things that we need to do. So how I see my role as a corporate foundation is also being a translator between these two worlds. We try to build bridges between the nonprofit world and the corporate world, and try to help understand each other and be able to define together what is needed in order to drive business approaches that help social development become a reality. How are we doing this? I think actually we're just at the starting point of all of this. I know that all of my corporate colleagues have a great ambition to make social development work for us at Hilti. And we look into ways to actually define how can we include a social perspective into everything that we do, and how can we help the nonprofit world learn from how we drive business. And it's a learning process that takes time, and maybe we don't have this time. So we need to accelerate fast to actually get there. So as I said before, we try to engage our corporate colleagues in take a consultancy role for the nonprofit world in looking into concrete developments, looking into helping our aid programs deliver faster, doing logistics and doing last mile distribution of our technologies and projects. And what I can also do as a foundation is help target the right people in our organization. When I speak with our partners from the development sector, they say, when I give a call to a normal corporate, I probably get to the CSR person, and the CSR person offers me money. What I want to achieve is I speak with a decision maker at Hilti, for example, because I want to offer to integrate all of what I want to achieve into their business model. And that's where we as a corporate foundation, for example, can help as well. So I think those are the processes that we need to look at when we describe the role of business in creating social development.
So we have a slightly different take on that question, Andy. I'm a representative of a company in a very heavily regulated industry. We manufacture and sell pesticide products around the world. And understandably and appropriately, federal agencies and state agencies regulate our ability to manufacture and sell and use those products around the world. And so we view government really as an essential partner in many respects to our business goals, which is to remain a global leader in seeds and crop protection and digital solution technologies. What we've seen though around the world is, in the European Union as an example, their goals related to pesticide use have been to ban entire classes, to unrealistically reduce the availability of those tools to farmers. And what that does is reduce the food supply available to those countries, particularly now in times of crisis, because food crises become political crises, to the governor's point. And we're seeing actually in some European countries, ag ministers pulling back a little bit and saying maybe we shouldn't go quite as quickly when it comes to the Green Deal or the Farm to Fork initiative that we're seeing in the EU right now. So while government is an essential partner for companies like mine, I think we also have to realize that our freedom to operate, our ability to provide tools to farmers around the world that allow them to develop resilient local economies and grow food for local populations can be significantly hampered by an overly burdensome regulatory structure. Now, I'm not saying that we need to get rid of all pesticide regulations. Clearly, that's led to cleaner air and water and food in many cases, but we just need to look at these crises that are emerging around the world and understand that companies like mine can really be partners towards a solution, working with the World Food Program, working with UNICEF, with other international organizations or national-based NGOs. And that's really, I think, going to be the key to solving some of these crises here. You asked the governor a few moments ago, what's really led to, this proliferation of problems in the here and now. And it's really, in many respects, the global interconnectedness of our national economies and borderless travel, pre-pandemic, and now we're getting back into that as well. So that crises that may have been confined to national borders in years gone by, explode like wildfire onto the world and impact the global supply chain and impact the ability of companies, of private organizations, foundations, international organizations to get the job done. So there's some significant challenges out there, but I think that, I'm a glass half full kind of guy. You have to be. And I really think that if we weave together these international solutions, led by foundations like the Hilti Foundation and companies like mine, we can really find a way to address some of these challenges. And you've got to take the long view. This is not going to be something that's solved overnight. It's not going to be something probably that's solved in the next decade or two. It's something that's going to take continual investment, continual effort, and just continual hard work.
Great.
Let me add right here because, and I can't be specific because you're going to see some announcements in the next few days and week, but we've been talking with the European leaders regarding relaxing some of the regulations that are going to be necessary to get through 2022. And it's been quite remarkable to see the Green Party, for example, in Germany and many other countries have really gotten very practical, realize we've got a crisis on our hand, and to see everybody sort of moderating a little bit in a world that seems like extremism, controls everything. But I'm seeing some moderation, and what can we do to get through 2022 to increase agricultural production? I got phone calls today from Ukraine saying, we got a pesticide problem. We've got to have some pesticides. To come in. So we're working through a lot of issues. We're not the pesticide people, but we are the supply chain people. So when we're moving food and supplies around the country, we can also deliver other things or at least create opportunities. But the next few months, the next few weeks, watch. There's going to be some extraordinary, I think, announcements that we'll see. I hope.
Thanks. If people have questions, feel free to just walk to the microphone. There seems to be lots of questions, and I'll continue, but if you do. There seems to be this tension listening to you between the long term and the short term. And it's going to take a long time. The solutions are over decades. But we hear a crisis that's tomorrow. And I was really taken by your diagnosis that the problem was the human heart. Or greed. How do we manage, and this is the classic issue of sustainability, how do we manage the short term and the long term? Are we doomed always just to respond when there's crises, or is there a way of changing how we see these things to try to develop longer term solutions?
Look, if you ask me, what does Hilti do in the current Ukraine crisis? Of course, all of my Hilti colleagues try to help. In all the neighboring countries, our Hilti offices are open to help refugees. We donate money. When you ask me what Hilti Foundation does, we give short-term assistance. We double every cent that our corporate colleagues donate in these times of crisis. And at the same time, it's important for us to what we call stay the course. That means we don't stop any other program that we have supported over the past years, because sustainability is the most important thing for us. And I think Governor Beasley explained it extremely well. The conflicts and the problems in other parts of the world don't stop because there's Ukraine now. On the opposite, they become even more difficult to solve. And that's why we need to continue to invest in the long-term problems. So indeed, I absolutely agree. There's the short term and there's the long term perspective, and we need to take both at the same time.
I'd say, Andy, that the short term, the near term problem is we've got 730 or so employees in Ukraine, and their safety is paramount to our corporate leaders. And, we're going to do everything that we can to support them. But we're not going to walk away from Ukraine, because we really want to be able to continue to support the Ukrainian farmers that are still in the fields. Many are not. Many have grabbed a weapon and are manning a post at this point. But, there are lots of Ukrainian farmers and Ukrainian agriculturalists that we're going to continue to support with our technologies, our seeds, and our crop protection tools. And the longer term solution, I think Johan touched on it, is developing a real sustainability ethic that is measured, that has metrics associated with it around climate, around biodiversity, around regenerative agriculture, around support for small shareholders, rural prosperity, particularly in the developing world, and to make that meaningful. And, I'm a relatively new employee at Syngenta, but it's a company that aligns with my own personal values when it comes to those issues. And I think that it's a real thing from our corporate leadership. And that's what every company, I think, is seeking these days, is how do we incorporate sustainability into the work that we do? How do we make our supply chains more sustainable, our products more sustainable, the tools that we provide, in our case, farmers and ranchers, more sustainable?
And I think we face another problem that you pointed us at as well, and that is throughout the pandemic, We had millions of people that moved into poverty on top of those who were there. I traveled in Peru and Colombia in September last year. And when you walk through what is probably called better neighborhoods of Bogota or Lima, you see hundreds of empty apartments, the stores are all closed, and basically you get the feeling that thousands of people from middle class were pushed into poverty. But how do you create sustainable development on an economic side when there is no middle class anymore? I think that will challenge us also in the next years, because we basically lost many of the efforts that we supported for so many years, and suddenly, we were pushed back by many years.
There's so many things are going through my mind about the future, and the young people particularly got to make some pretty hard decisions about nations that should be agricultural producers that are not producing because of war, conflict, and corruption. What do you do about that? Because the world has an obligation to make certain that every human being has a right to food. And when you have a mass land that is not being productive, and as we continue to work on better seeds, better yields, better fertilizers, and greening the process up, there's a lot of big issues. And then you get into the waste issues. And this is where I think the young people can be extraordinary. We waste $2 trillion worth of, over $1 trillion worth of food per year. 2 billion people can be fed just by waste and waste alone. In the United States and Western countries, for example, 1/3 of the food is wasted at the dinner table. 1/3. In the developing nations, it's in the field to the marketplace. And this is one of the things on the Farm to Market Alliance that we work on: better storage, better protection of what is coming out of the field, because that 1/3 can completely salvage a nation as we speak. So there's a lot of different issues to be working on, hydroponics, and you got to be thinking, how do I create food security for my nation, but at the same time be concerned about other nations? I wish we had a lot more time to get into this, because this is an area that we're working on. Take, for example, you have a country where, real simple one, not to get into which country, but a country that has a very corrupt leadership. And if I can create sustainability and resilience for the independent smallholder farmers, where they can feed themselves in their villages, well, they're then less vulnerable to the politics of the extremes in that country. I'm not going to get into which countries, but I've been hard on the Western donors, is that, oh, we don't want to do development in that country. I said, that's fine. Then destroy the hopes and the lives of 20 million people because you don't like that one leader. I can come in there and create food security for the smallholder families in the villages, and they're no longer vulnerable to the politics of the leader of that nation. But, oh, give me go started. I get so mad.
All right, we're going to turn it. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. So I'm gonna.
It's easy. No, it's not complicated at all.
Let me repeat the question,
Yeah.
because the question was around, how do you ensure the security of food aid in corrupt countries, which would be any type of aid?
Yeah, that's right. I can't begin to tell you how much money we spend on systems and verification and analysis and auditing and making certain that it's transparency and the things that we do. We might use fingerprinting on beneficiaries, eye scan, facial recognition, depends on each country, and how do we prevent fraud as well as diversion of aid. Because we're out there feeding 125 million people in some of the toughest places on earth. And so we have systems in place. We spend a lot of money making certain, because the United States gives us, for example, $3.8 billion. I can't begin to tell you, I think we're overregulated, too much bureaucracy, quite frankly, but it comes with, when you're the world's largest operation, they want to make sure everything is good. And if you came to our headquarters and see all that we do, you're like, this is a little bit too much, quite frankly. But even with that, you run into, these are tough places, particularly you going into a place for the first time, and it's nothing but a war zone, and there's been hundreds of years of corruption. How you gonna, who you gonna partner with? And so we put a lot of systems in place, and the measurables, it's quite remarkable and extensive, what we do and how we do it. And if somebody gets sick by a grain of food in a particular village, we can track that. We can track that bag of food. I don't want to get into what country, but a country not here that I shut down all purchases of hundreds of millions of dollars just like that, because we could track it back to that particular farm where they had a particular weed that didn't meet the requirements from the seller, and they lied about it, and we caught them and we shut it down. And they didn't think, most people don't think the UN will step up pretty hard. Well, I'm not your typical UN kind of guy, as you can imagine. So, and we will shut down a program and operation. And like with the Houthis in Yemen or the Taliban, I mean, I've met with the Taliban a dozen times in the last few months. And I've said, and be very clear, because they aren't used to a UN person saying, look, I don't have enough money now to feed everybody I need in the world. And if you want to give me an excuse, if I can feed 2 children over here for $1 and I can feed only 1 here for $1 because of your diversion and your problems, trust me, I'm sending it over there. Good luck. If you want me to help your children, then you need to cooperate and don't get in the way of our operations. We do this around the world. I'm not going to play games with you. And they've learned, not just the Taliban, but not just the Houthis, but the ISIS or the Al-Qaedas or even donor nations. I could get into the pretty sensitive stories where.
Well, let's
another day.
In fact, I think you have an invitation when you're finished to teach a class, and I think we would all take it, because dealing with corrupt societies is a lot. Let's go. Let me take more than one question. Let's go with 3 questions, and we'll open up because we're running out of time. So, please.
Thank you for your time, gentlemen. I'm an alumni of the International Business Program here, and I'm glad to be here today. And I'm originally from Sri Lanka, and a country. Food prices have gone up by 30% or so over the last month due to various reasons, and one of them mainly being political corruption. So you were talking about how you saw 2022 was going to be a disastrous year. And if there are certain countries where there are certain trends and they are going downhill, are there any programs, or when does the World Food Program interfere and make sure it'll be best to do something right now versus waiting until everything goes downhill and everybody in that country need help? And my second part of the question is, we hear about the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and every year there's some kind of crisis coming up, and when something comes up, does all these Sustainable Development Goals change? And does the countries and the private sector, what they do, does that change as well? Thank you.
Right, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? My name's Suzanne. Thank you all for your time. My question is going back to the smallholder farmer discussion in private sector. I'm curious to know how your organizations are engaging in the carbon markets, which are creating new business models and new income for smallholder farmers that practice regenerative agriculture and agroforestry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you all for being here. I'm graduating in the International MBA program this May, but I'm also a returned Peace Corps volunteer serving from Ghana. So my question, we talked a little bit about this short-term versus long-term, and my question is, how do we start to shift some of our mindset from the short-term to the long-term when we are still like having to meet short-term goals of quarters and annual growth and things like that? What does the conversations of that actually look like on boards, and how do you shift a mindset within a company around that?
Thank you. Go ahead. We'll take your last one too.
So
all of you have mentioned the importance of personal involvement in the development of communities and resources in developing nations, and specifically Chad was brought up. I'm curious, in the US, we tend to outsource this responsibility to the public sector and to corporations as individual citizens. I'm curious, with the crisis at hand, what steps as individual citizens can we do to support our communities and then step outside our borders?
Okay, thank you so much. It was, go ahead, no.
That's my
No.
wife for you.
That's fine. So I'm going to summarize them all together, and then I'll open it up. The last one was a student trying to make sense of this, but all the other ones is global interdependency, which you brought up. And food is tied to corruption, and it's tied to climate change, and it's tied to global organization. What should citizens and young people do as they think about all these issues? Just the pure complexity of it all.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in for starters here. This is a series of deep and profound questions, really. I mean, it gets to the heart of what we're doing as a society and what we're trying to accomplish through organizations like the Governors or my company or foundations like Johan's. You know, I think that we've got to continue to be engaged, I guess I would say to the person that asked the last question there. Don't retreat. You know, what we've seen a lot of in the last couple of years is people retreating to the comfort of their homes, and now everybody's working from home. And clearly we had a global pandemic, but I think that we need to re-engage with the world and continue to think globally about these big issues, but act locally, as the old bumper sticker goes. You know, you've got to be able to think about these things and acknowledge the fact that they're hugely complicated and very tragic in many respects, but at the same time, look for the potential for finding a solution, whether it's supporting a local farmer by shopping at the farmer's market, or whether it's donating to UNICEF, or things that you can do as, you know, an individual, as a citizen, or banding together with people of goodwill who are working together on similar issues. When that happens, great things happen. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to continue to remain engaged, Andy, and that's what I would say to all of the students here in the room tonight is, you know, think about giving back, think about paying it forward, think about being involved in your community, and don't give up. Can't give up.
Johan, and then I'm going to give the last word to the Governor.
I couldn't agree more. I think for me, it would really be important that we all try to understand the complexities of our current system. When I look at my friends back home in Switzerland, many have gone vegan or vegetarian, which I think is great. And, you know, that's how people think, and that's how they try to make their contribution. And then they go to the supermarket and buy soya that has been produced in Brazil, and don't think about that, you know, that has to be brought to Switzerland as well. So we need to think a little beyond the, you know, our immediate thought of what can we do to contribute to the global good. And I think, you know, here at a business school, that's exactly what we want to learn. I think, you know, in the introductions we learned here, this program really wants to make us understand how the world works. And that's, for me personally, the most important thing that we need to do. Understand how the world works. Don't be satisfied with the easy answers, but really think beyond it, understand the complexity of how our world works, and try to find out what can I do personally when I look at these complexities, and, you know, integrate these thoughts into my normal life. And then many opportunities will open up. Maybe so much from my side.
All those questions are good. You know, one of the questions is, I get a lot, do I still believe that we can, and the United Nations Sustainable SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, can we end world hunger by 2030? And the answer is actually yes. If we end the wars, there's no doubt we can get there. Even with climate extremes, we can avoid famine, we can end particularly acute food insecurity. No doubt in my mind, but we're not ending wars, it's getting worse and getting worse. Don't hesitate to be engaged in your local community. You'll be surprised who might be struggling in your own neighborhood. Please don't think it's just in Africa or it's just in the Middle East. There are people here in our own country that are struggling. So be willing to step out of your own comfort of your own home, and you'll be quite surprised. And I can assure you that you'll be blessed more than they will. One of the questions, how do we shift mindset? This device right here, if you young people, if you don't figure it out, will bring the end of the modern era. There's so much information and there's so much propaganda. You have got to determine how to mature it. Because with what we see out there, it's frightening. I love and hate this thing. And I've got brilliant friends on the left and the right that believe so much of the junk they read. I'm like, did you just turn off your brain or something? How can you even believe that's the truth? But you know, they're so caught up into the moment of politics, it just blows my mind. And sometimes you need to cut this thing off and just go out there and go give somebody a hug, pat on the back, because I am the ultimate optimist. I really am. And there's a lot of bad stuff out there, but I still have great hope. And I've got great hope that the young people are going to help us achieve these goals. But please understand, we've made a lot of progress and headway, but it is going to be on your back to get us out of this mess we're in right now. And we are in a mess. And if I could just start going through about 20 countries in conflict and war right now, not just Ukraine, not just Yemen, not just Syria, not just, you know, I go on and on and on, and you'll get discouraged, but don't. You can end poverty. You can end hunger. You've got some incredible opportunities ahead of you with the technology that is developing, but you can't eat these things. You still got to have food. It's just good old food. And we're going to figure this thing out, because I know you young people out there, I mean, when I hear you, and I can't remember the number, something like 75% of all the people that work at the World Food Program, Gresham, is under age 35. Under age 35. And when I sit and listen to them, it's like, wow, you guys know so much more than I did at your age. It's remarkable. And so take advantage of the access to information, but please, please don't let propaganda manipulate you to be full of hatred and emotion. Care for the poor, care for the needy, care for one another. My best friends, when I was in the House of Representatives, were my biggest enemies on the floor. We didn't agree on issues, but we respected each other, and we would vote and fight on the floor, but we'd go have dinner and laugh, and I respected others who had different views. You know, it's just, that's what makes the world so wonderful. We're all equal, and yet we're all individually special. And so young people, we're dependent on you.
Well, I'm going to say thank you to our panelists so much, and I was glad we ended on hope, even though we did talk a lot about fear today. And I think this was the start of a conversation, and I apologize that we really didn't get any questions from online, but I think we could talk about this forever. And I would take that class, because the experiences of international and all the supply chain people out there and the accountant people, there's jobs for you in terms of doing these problems. So thank you very much.
Thank you.